Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here, and I don't often have opportunities to talk about soils to non-soil scientists, and so it's a really big honor to be here today. When I was a boy, we used to talk about heroes, and I remember my dad talking to my brothers and I. What's a hero? Somebody that's willing to sacrifice for the good of somebody else, to make a sacrifice for others. Well, when I talk to my children about heroes, they're not so interested nowadays. They want to know about superheroes. It's like an inflation of heroes, right? Everything has to be one up on everything. I want to give this talk today about soils, the importance of soils, the important role that soils have, and I'm going to do my best not to inflate it. Right? Because it's not necessary to inflate it. I want to talk to you about these roles of soil because they are important roles. Soils have an important role. And I'm going to try to just talk it to you straight. First, I want to give a little bit of my own soil story. I grew up in a family where my dad had his career in the Air Force. And we moved around, different places, different countries and different locations in the States. No, I don't have any agricultural background at all. We hardly, on the bases we live, could even have a garden of any sorts. And I honestly never thought about soil growing up. But when I was starting out off in college, I was really asking those questions about who am I, what am I called to study? And I really, I was thinking about that, giving it serious consideration and prayerfully. And I realized within me was a big desire to help people that were hungry. Whether I met people on the street, whether I heard programs about Somalia or other places where there were famines and droughts, but I really had this desire inside of me to try to feed the hungry. And so I looked in my college catalog, and we didn't have online. We actually had a book. We had remember those books? I looked in there and I thought, well, let me look under agriculture. And I came to a department, the name was Agronomy. I've never heard the word before in my life, but the first two courses were Introduction to Crop Science and Introduction to Soil Science. And I took those classes. I liked the crop science course, but I loved the soil science class. The teacher was excellent. Not only did you get the nuts and bolts as an introduction to soils, but he gave this sense. Somebody used the word earlier, I think Sister Damien, about the awe and wonder, or I often say the beauty and wonder of soil. Something that I'd never thought about before. It just kind of opened up something new inside of me, so I changed my major and continued to study that. And somehow through the graduate school process, I kind of got formed as a scientist in the secular way of thinking. I was studying hard, working hard, doing my research, everything. And I got into this pattern of science first, not necessarily God first. And work, go home to rest so I could work some more. But then there came an accident when I was a young professor at Iowa State. We had a daughter who died in an accident, just a young girl. And that caused me to stop again, look at my life and my priorities, and I made some decisions to go back to prayer, go back to the Catholic faith that I was raised in, and to try to, best I could, have God as the first priority, then family, and then work. And everything started to come into place, fall into good order, and goodness for me. And I started to grow in that sense of the earth, part of God's creation, and our role as humans to try to study, understand, and scientists so that we could be good stewards and we could serve humanity based on what we can learn in our science. That helped me a lot. And then the second thing, it kind of came up in the questions in the last talk, but the relationships. I flipped and I started to think, rather than just wanting to look at students, for example, on how they got the project done, write that paper, all these kinds of things that the secular world will measure our contributions, I started to think, how can I be a better mentor? How can I serve my students rather than my students serve me? How can I serve them by helping them to grow as scientists and as persons, and help them to grow spiritually as well as academically? And it's been a beautiful experience. I know there's a lot of young people here, and many young people I talk to have doubts about getting jobs in academia because of the demands. But I like to say that the beauty of working with young people, helping to form the next generation of scientists, particularly if as whole people, scientists with faith, is just such an honor and a privilege. And I really want to encourage you all. I brought with me, I have a couple of writings that I gave short on relationships and mentoring students. I brought a few copies that I just put over here on this piano or organ, whatever it is. Feel free to pick those up. And secondly, I saw in my career that because people put science first, and it's not really science first, but it's productivity. It's the next grant, the next paper, the next presentation, whatever. And they have a lot of family difficulty. I saw that. So my wife and I took some time, because we wanted to have a strong family with a faith basis. So we took some time to write a book also on the domestic church. So we brought several copies of this book with us. If you're interested, look us up. We'll hook you up with a copy. Okay. So anyway, I really, really love being a soil scientist, being a Catholic scientist, and I'm so happy for this society and to be here today. Let's talk some about soil now. Critical zone. How many of you have heard of the critical zone? So several have. So the first time I heard about it was through the National Science Foundation. They started up a new program on the critical zone, and they have critical zone observatories. And I studied up on that. They defined it as this portion of the earth just above the surface and just below the surface that's really, really important for sustaining life on Earth. And on the critical zone, an important component of that is soil. But when I looked at the National Science Foundation committee and group that got together to put this program together, I saw zero soil scientists involved. It was mostly geologists, hydrologists, and in fact, I have another slide that shows, again, the critical zone, kind of a cartoon, but it's all about hydrology and the water cycle. And the fact is that soil science is a young science. It's not very big. It's not very broad, but it's important. I think maybe we'll see by the end of the talk that soil's important and soil science is important, but it's not well integrated yet into the earth and environmental system sciences. Most of the soil science programs are in the agricultural college and departments of agronomy working on agricultural issues, not in the earth science department working on environmental issues, but they should be. They should be in both. And so I'm going to talk about that today. Soils are the foundation for food, certainly for terrestrial food production. We also grow much of the biomass used for bioenergy on soils. They're a foundation for that. I don't know if they're a foundation, but they're a contributor to water quality. Can have some positive effects of filtering types of thinking, or can be contributing to water pollution. The biggest water pollutant is soil. It's from soil erosion, okay? It's soil itself getting into the water. Then also, from a non-point source pollution perspective, it would be fertilizers, pesticides, manure, other amendments that are applied to soil, these chemicals that get into the water. I'll talk more about that. Then finally, they're the foundation for road beds of soil, both paved roads and unpaved roads, which is a big factor on our terrestrial transportation, our surface transportation. And there's much work done, especially by geotechnical engineers, making measurements and trying to manage the soil, engineering properties so that you'll have stable roadbeds. And I'll talk a little bit about this also. Okay, I want to talk about the big three natural resources. These are the big three materials. I'm not thinking about sunshine right here, but the material on Earth. So one is air. And it's universally recognized the importance of air. We all know we need to breathe. We want good quality air. We need oxygen, right? Yeah, it's not meant to be a joke, but I'll take it. I like jokes. I like jokes. So many countries have clean air acts, and they're interested in the air quality. It's universally known by all the citizens. Water, the importance of water. We want plenty of water and good quality water. We need potable water, and we have laws, Clean Water Acts, and people know it and understand it. Water is a big issue globally on the availability, good drinking water and water for other purposes. Soils are the other resource on the big three for sustaining life. And they're underappreciated. At first I wrote unappreciated, then I thought, well, I got to stay to that superhero thing. I better say underappreciated. Not many people really think about soil, right? We breathe air, we drink water, but we don't eat soil, but we eat what's grown on the soil. So we think about food, but not about the source, the foundation for much of our food, of the soil. But it's a natural resource that's important for our life on Earth. I call it the Rodney Dangerfield natural resource. It just can't get no respect. It doesn't get any respect. We might spit on it. We call it names like dirt. That's why I chose the word soils with the S on it, so it would be a 5-letter word rather than dirt. Dirt in my family is like a 4-letter word in my family. And so, but we don't treat it right. I'm not a theologian at all, but I think about soils kind of like analogies. I could make a lot of analogies, I won't, but toward how we think about the poor. We just ignore it, or we mistreat it. We don't see the value often. But soils are important, and I'm going to tell you why. One reason could be economic reasons. There's billions of dollars in agricultural productions for crops and livestock, and soil's the foundation for that. Just in my little state of Iowa, we have 19% of the corn grown there, number one in the states, 14% of soybeans. We alternate with this state, Illinois, back and forth, 1 and 2. We have 30% of the hogs, 15% of the chickens laying eggs. So it's just enormous production, and all of it, whether it's plant-based or animal-based, the soil's the foundation because you got to feed those animals. There's a special importance of the big three that I think we should put on soils because they're vulnerable. Soils are the foundation of agricultural systems, but they're vulnerable. They're vulnerable because they're right at the surface. So they're exposed. They can experience accelerated erosion and be gone. They won't reproduce again. They won't develop again in our lifetimes if they're washed away, for example. The pollution from the surface can affect them. They can deal with some pollution. We can get by. Others, no go. It'll get into the food chain. There's natural cycles that provide some opportunities for renewal for air and water just through the hydrologic cycle and the circulation system. But soils don't really cycle. They're just in place. So we have an extra responsibility to take care of them right where they are. We have to protect them where they're at. Charles Kellogg was a known agricultural scientist. This is a quote from 1938. As scientists become more and more specialized and objectives narrow, coordination of attack in applied fields becomes more difficult. I don't know the situation in 1938, but it's got to be worse today. I mean, even in soil science, we have so many subdisciplines. My area is soil physics. And even within soil physics, I don't specialize on mechanics, compaction and tilling and that sort of thing. I look at heat and mass transfer within soil. We've got soil chemistry, soil biology, soil fertility, soil ad nauseum kind of thing, where we break it down. But really, if we want to study soils and their important roles, we need to look at the whole soil within the Earth environmental systems that we have here. We somehow have to get beyond just the narrow subdisciplines. In all the graduate programs that I'm aware of, we teach narrow disciplines. I teach soil physics. Somebody else teaches soil chemistry. But we really need to come to grips with the sense of the whole soil within the system and to be able to work together in a multidisciplinary group of scientists to look at these systems together. A person in my group gave me this photo, and so it just reminded me of this. I don't know what these guys are doing, but they obviously have their heads in the soil. They're studying something. They're learning something, but I don't know what it is. They're not talking to anybody, and if they do talk to somebody, it's going to be the soil scientist next to them. And so it's really seriously a privilege to be here as a soil scientist to talk to non-soil scientists about the importance of soil. And we need to do that more. There needs to be, I think, in both ways, not just soil science in agriculture, but soil science on all the earth and environmental systems where it plays a role. And I hope that can happen. We need to grow up as a science, but we also need to find a place within the greater groupings of scientists. Because there's big issues that soil has an impact on. Hunger, we want to think about the question of world hunger. There are really, really millions of people malnutrition and starving in the world right now. Soil is a foundation for our crop production, our food production. It's important to look at soil, how to manage it, how to use it to produce efficiently, effectively, to help to feed hungry people. Bioenergy, all of you know the fossil fuel situation and gas prices and everything. And it used to be maybe a decade ago, there was a big move for bioenergy. I had projects in Iowa on bioenergy. And then, with all the new discoveries and technologies and cheap fossil fuel, they kind of fell away. But I think we'll have some chances now to come back for looking at biomass production on soils for bioenergy. Water quality and water quantity. Because the soil is right at the surface, it impacts the water cycle, hydrologic cycle. So water quantity, how much water infiltrates, how much water runs off, this type of thing. Somebody was talking about flooding, I think, maybe in the last talk it came up. How you compact the soil. We get bigger and bigger farming equipment compacting the soil, more runoff, more flooding is happening. So water quantity issues, water quality issues. Again, soil is one of the biggest polluters, whatever I said before. Climate change. You can't turn around today without bumping into somebody talking about climate change, but not many people talk about soil. It's a factor there because the plants growing in the soil have photosynthesis, fixing CO2. A lot of that is placed in the soil through the root system or as plant residue, surface residue, left behind on the soil. And there's a possibility to store carbon within soil as organic matter. But also, if we mismanage the soil, we release CO2. And so this is a real big issue. That and nitrous oxide and methane also are very important greenhouse gases that people study on the soil. Additionally, the whole topic of energy balance. We talk a lot about greenhouse gases, but we don't talk a lot about energy balance. And I'll mention that in just a moment. Transportation. The roads require soils. These soils offer challenges. Some soils will shrink and swell. If you wet, they swell. If you dry, they shrink and crack. This causes problems on roads. Some soils, if they freeze, you'll get an ice lens building up, you'll get a lifting, and you'll get a frost heaving and cracking in potholes. Probably you've heard this before, but in our state of Iowa, we say there's 2 seasons. There's winter and then there's road repair, right? And so goes on. And so there's a lot of knowledge that needs to be done in terms of managing the soil, understanding the properties to be able to build stable roads. I want to just go around this circle and talk a little bit about these topics one by one, because I think they'll spell out the important role or vital role of soil on these various topics. So I'm going to start with plants, soils and plants, soils and water, soils and weather or climate, soils and ecosystems, soils and pollution, and soils and human health. Soils and plants. Plants need soil. Terrestrial plants need soil. They need soil for water. They need soil for nutrients. They need soil for oxygen. There's a root respiration. There's an exchange of gases that go on. And they need the physical strength of soil. As the roots grow, it needs to be stable to hold the plant upright above the ground to be able to have gas exchange and receive radiation from the sun. But soils need plants as well. Plants are having photosynthesis. They're putting the carbon, fixing the carbon, and putting it into the soil. The more organic matter we have in our mineral soils, the better quality, the healthier the soils are. So soils need plants as well. We have a whole bunch of research recently about, this is not technical talk, but designer plants, right? Manipulating the plants to get new genome type of things, genetic things. And so we have this, but all these things are eventually going to have to be tested by growing them in the soil. It's not just a laboratory type of measurement that should happen. But not a lot of that is happening right now. But we have to look at it to see, what's the best way to have our plants in our managed ecosystems. We have to actually grow them outdoors. Soils and water. At any moment in time, there's more fresh water stored in our soils than all the rivers in the world. And this is really, really important water because it's life-sustaining water for the system, for the Earth system, the biota that's growing outside. It's really important water. The effect of soils on the hydrology, how much water runs off or infiltrates, some of that is topography, but some of it is hydraulic properties of the soil, how readily water can move in soil. We don't even know, we don't have it mapped over the earth what the soil hydraulic properties are. We don't even have such great measurements on water content. If we change the water content of the soil, not we change it, as the water content of the soil changes, okay, it affects every physical, chemical, and biological property of the soil. And we don't have that deep understanding of how this is happening at different locations on the earth. Soils and climate. This may look like a funny slide for soils and climate, but it's one we can see visually, so I chose it. We have to think about this as microclimate in this sense, but the same relationships will hold for meso and macroclimate. So let me see, I have a thing, we have a irrigated, wet, and a light-colored, dry soil conditions. This is more like an arid environment, so we can, I want to capture this contrast. Soil water content in particular has a great effect on the surface energy balance. In this particular case, just side by side, the wet and the dry. Think about just the radiation balance first. We have shortwave and long wave radiation coming in. We have some of the shortwave in particular reflected. There'll be a greater reflectance on the dry soil than on the wet soil. The wet soil will absorb more of the solar radiation. We also have radiation emitted, right? The Stefan-Boltzmann equation, depending on the temperature. There'll be a different temperature on the wet soil than the dry soil. The dry soil has a very small heat capacity. The wet soil, water has a really large heat capacity, much larger, so it'll be in the daytime a cooler temperature on the wet soil than the dry soil. So it's a different, all those terms summed together, we can call the net radiation. Then that net radiation will partition into heating the ground, heating the air, or evaporating water, right? So a sensible heat flux, a latent heat flux in the soil, in the air. They're totally different based on the water content. On the dry, there's very little water to evaporate, so very small latent heat flux. So that soil gets really hot. You have large thermal gradients, down in the daytime, up in the nighttime for soil heat flux, and you have a possibility for the ground to heat the air in the daytime because it gets really hot, much hotter than the air. On the wet part, that particular one, a lot of that net radiation will partition into evaporating water, a latent heat flux. Be much cooler temperature. You'll have a larger thermal conductivity and a larger heat capacity on the wet than the dry, but you have a smaller thermal gradient on the wet than the dry. So those will be factors on the soil heat flux, and there'll be less heating of the air, less sensible heat on the wet. This kind of picture on this small scale holds true everywhere. This is just basic physics right here. It's going to hold true at different scales as well. I don't know if any of you are, modeling the global climate, the GCM, general circulation model, but when I talk to scientists working on that, they tell me that soil moisture, especially soil surface moisture content, is a driver, is a forcing function for the climate. The problem is we don't measure regularly the soil surface water content. You can watch, the news, talk about whether it's going to rain or not, or the humidity or the temperature, but they're not telling you the soil water content. Part of that is it's complicated. Soil water content varies depending on landscape position and type of soil, and it changes with time, depending on rainfall or evaporation types of things. But this is the kind of information that would be really important, and one way that we could improve our knowledge and understanding of these Earth systems by starting to do more measurements of the soil water content. Soils and ecosystems, wherever we have terrestrial ecosystems, forests like this picture, wetlands, deserts, permafrost, wherever, soil's going to be a factor on the ecosystems, both on products and services. It's not just agriculture. That's what I'm trying to say today. Soil science should not be just confined to agriculture, agroecosystems. We're going to have products, food, feed, fuel, fiber, different regulating services, like I'm talking about on water, climate, on greenhouse gases, these types of things, disease, different nutrient cycling. It's a big part, a lot of issues with carbon cycle and nitrogen cycle, but others also go on, and there's involved microorganisms, other things in the soil that are super important. Cultural services, educational, aesthetic, recreation, tourism. Where's Sister Damien? Something in here has got to be on faith. So something's got to be here on that. Okay, the next topic, soils and pollutants. This is one of my favorite areas of investigation in science because it has complexities, but they're important for humanity. And I chose this photo to put on here. It looks more like some industrial kind of pollution sort of thing. Maybe you got heavy metals or some organic compounds, polluting the soil. And, some of these soil can be filtering. Some of these get into the soil. Heavy metals are hard to get out of the soil when they get in. Others we can do air sparging, and we can remove some of the volatile organics in some ways. But different pollutants have different impacts. In Iowa, my home state, lots of agriculture. Soil's the biggest pollutant, and then fertilizers, pesticides, these kinds of soil amendments are pollutants. So there are a lot of inorganic pollutants. But if we look at the fate and transport of chemicals in soil, it's a beautifully complicated kind of a situation. From a physics perspective, it's very difficult to know the three-dimensional pore structure, how the pores are connected. So it's very difficult from first principles to calculate how mass will move. So we have to do some empirical measurements in order to quantify some models, okay? But also there's chemistry. The soils are a variety of different materials, soil solids. Some they absorb some chemicals, they repulse some chemicals, some stay behind, some go forward, depending on the nature of the soil and the chemicals. And then there's the biology. Do the biology, first off, are they taken up by plants? Do they get into the food chain? Or are they degraded by microorganisms? These will be different effects on different chemicals. And so altogether, if you look at pollution, chemical transport, cleaning up soils from pollutants, that sort of thing, you got to have solid physics, chemistry, and biology working together because they're all involved. That's where you need this multidisciplinary approach to pollution. And that's just part of the earth and environmental system, just the soil itself. Okay, plus, I'll just say in agriculture, we put sometimes subsurface drains in. We call tile drains, but they're not really tile now, but they're subsurface drains. And these can provide a short circuit of pollutants to go from the soil to the surface water. We always, in Iowa, in the springtime, when we get thaw, we always have great increases of nitrate concentrations in our river waters. The Des Moines Waterworks has the largest or second largest nitrate remover in the world for water treatment. It's just that we do some things that maybe don't have a good effect for pollution, managing the pollution. Soils and health. Healthy soils, good plants, healthy food, good in the food chain. Unhealthy soils, pollutants, we can get some bad stuff in the food chain. I'm aware of a report from China where they talked about maybe 19% of their agricultural land being polluted by heavy metals. One particular area in Hunan province was known for their rice production, but now the Chinese people don't want to buy rice from there because it would let known that heavy metals were in that rice. So it really has shut down the sales of food because the food is seen to be tainted from that area. Second thing is on health, also for medicines. Some of our antibiotics are derived from soil microorganisms. Here's a quote from Leonardo da Vinci. "We know more about the movement of celestial bodies than about the soil underfoot." And I just took this because it had colors in it. You can see it's different coloring. Maybe you can get a sense for that representing different kinds of soils or different soil properties with depth. I couldn't believe in Sister Damien's talk she referred to Star Trek, so I'm going to do it also here. Who would have guessed, So this is an issue of Science Magazine from 2004. If you're in soil science, you'll hang on to stuff like this because you don't get much press in soil science. Sad but true. One of the quotes in one of the articles, soils are the most complicated biomaterials on the planet. And I just wanted to point out on the cover, I don't know if you can see it, where it says soils. You can see that word soils, right? But below that, it has a quote that it's a knockoff from Star Trek, right? What did they say on Star Trek? Space, the final frontier. This one says, but based on the editors of Science, soils, the final frontier. And then they made the argument that we don't know very much about soil. It's complicated. It's three. What am I trying to say? I lost my word. 3 phases. What am I trying to say? I was going to say dimensional. 3 phases. Okay, solid, liquid, and gas. And it's complicated on the pore structure. It's not the same everywhere. On the physics side, on the chemistry side, it has inorganic chemicals and organic chemicals inside. It has a surface area, like many soils, topsoil in Iowa, 1 gram, just a little bit on your hand can have hundreds of square meters of surface area where water can be held, microorganisms can live, soil solution chemistry can take place. It's a complex material, but I think most of all complex on the biology. It has not only the higher level plants you can see in the photo, but it has fauna, earthworms and insects. It has reptiles laying eggs in soil. It's got all kinds of animals that live in the soil. But most of all, it has microorganisms galore in the soil. In 1 little gram of soil, from good Iowa topsoil, I'll say it like that, can have 1 billion microorganisms living there. And these microorganisms, as a community, we have different ways to kind of characterize the community, what's there, but not so many good ways to characterize the function of what's going on. I think this is going to be a great way forward to try to understand more and more about this part of the soil biology, the microbiology of soil, because it impacts many of the other properties and features of soil. It's somewhat related, sort of, maybe you heard about the gut biome, right? So many microorganisms inside of us. We have so many microorganisms in the soil also that have specific functions that we're just discovering. We have a lot of things to discover on soil. I also want to say that soils vary from location to location. This is a map. The coloring represents, in our classification system, soil orders. We have different soil orders. You can see they're distributed around just the U.S., but around the world also. I just focus on the U.S. here. There's been mapped 22,000 uniquely identified soils in the U.S. Some properties are varying. Something's different from soil to soil. Some states have more than 1,000 different kinds of soils. This is one of the challenges. I talked many times with my colleagues in agronomy who work on the genome, maybe the corn genome, and they tell me, yeah, well, that's basically it's big deal, but it's corn. Soils are varying from location to location, and even a particular soil, whether it was compacted or not compacted, whether it's wet or dry, all the properties are changing. I have this list of things that I don't know why I put it here, but some recognition to soils. The International Year of Soils from United Nations 2015. Laudato Si, that we've just heard about, mentioned soils 2015. There's a Soil Health Institute that was established in 2015. I think this is a good way to go, thinking about soil health, healthy soil, healthy people types of things. Maybe bring this more to the attention of citizens. The Congress, U.S. Congress, established a Soils Caucus for rapid exchange of information in 2006. National Academy of Science had a Frontiers in Science in 2005, and then the Critical Zone that I mentioned earlier from National Science Foundation in 2005. But in general, soils don't get a lot of respect. People don't give them a lot of attention, but they're very important in my humble opinion. We have a lot of degradation. It can be water erosion, wind erosion, different things we can see on this map. And I want to just give 3 examples, kind of wrapping up my talk. One, I want to have an example from Iowa, example from China, Lost Plateau, and an example from Japan, Fukushima nuclear disaster. So I just want to show some soils in Iowa. We have 2 bars. These are just different locations, like a top, a slope, and a bottom of a landscape. And this greenish color is the prairie, and the bluish color would be cropped land. And then this is soil carbon, or we can think about it as soil organic matter in there. Every situation, every location, the soil carbon or organic matter is larger in the prairie. The cropland, a lot of it is tilled, stirred up. A lot of the organic matter becomes available to microorganisms for decomposition. And so then this becomes a release of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Excuse me. In the larger organic matter can be like a sink. So we have a room to have a sink for some of the carbon dioxide in the soil because of our tillage and because of our cropping system. Sometimes monocropping, we harvest a lot of the organic matter that's in the soil. But there's room with good management to put that back to increase soil organic matter. Reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. There's room for that. This is a photo of China Loess Plateau. I've done quite a bit of investigation over there. This was a photo from the 1980s. It's nothing growing there. Everything used to be harvested, not even crop residue left behind, and you can see all the gullies of severe erosion that was going on. There were some World Bank projects, and Chinese government put an emphasis to try to have better management. This is up in the area of the Yellow River. The reason it's the Yellow River is because the soil has a yellow color, and it's loaded with this from erosion up there. This would be part of a sign of some reclamation. This is probably from the 1990s, maybe up toward 2000, where the cropland is down in the lower part and trying to get more perennial vegetation on the slopes and the top, making some progress there, and then making even more progress over there in terms of working with that natural environment and trying to have managed agroecosystems that will work on that. It's really a good strategy that, we used to just try to make the most money rather than caring for the creation. This is a picture of a machine that's digging up the soil. In the Fukushima disaster in Japan, there was an earthquake, tsunami, that the power plant released a lot of radiation from that. This is like a decade ago, or a little more than a decade ago. And a lot of that had fallout of radioactive material on villages nearby. This would be one of those such villages. In this particular case, particularly cesium polluted the land here, and there's no way to get it out. Actually, the whole village is evacuated. And they finally decided they had to dig it up. And cesium was sorbed to some of the soil particles, and so it was able to be contained for the most part in the top layer, the topsoil. But I'll tell you what, I sometimes ask this to my students: what's the most important soil? Like, what's the most important soil in Iowa? And they'll tell me the name of a soil, some kind of soil series, right? But I say it's the topsoil. It's the most important part is the topsoil, because it has the most organic matter, the best productivity. It's the most valuable and important soil. Here they dug up the topsoil and bagged it and stored it. I don't know what they're going to do with it. I could see the bags covered with tarps in the field, but they're going to have to remove the soil and do something with it. But what's happened is, once they dug up the soil, they invited the villagers to come back. And a lot of the villagers came back, but none of the young people came back. Just the older folk, older population came back. They wanted to come back and farm again, but the young people already got established at other locations, so they didn't come back. I went to a church, went to Mass in a church outside of Tokyo, and at that church, Catholic church, they had, after Mass, they were selling produce that was grown in this area in support of the farmers that went back to live in this area. kind of like my parish in Iowa, we're connected with a group in Honduras, right? We sell coffee to try to get them a fair price on the coffee like that. This was people trying to sell produce because people in Japan didn't want to buy produce from this area because they knew about the pollution. But it turns out the produce is so tested. It's more tested and evaluated and measured here than any other place in Japan. And so they were, they were working on, trying to get a fair price and a market for the farmers that came back. But they also say it's more tested, it's safer based on, measurements type of thing. But anyway, that's a problem. Once soil gets polluted, there's the possibility that we lose it. That's maybe the point that I'm making right now. It's very vulnerable. It's right at the surface. It's not something that's going to regenerate in our lifetime. It's a geological material. It's going to take hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years to develop, to form new soil. And so we have to be especially careful to care for and protect our soil. Some important actions for us to think about are try to reverse the spending of our soil's capital. Do what we can to reduce erosion, accelerated erosion, reduce compaction, salinization. We have water deficits when we lose organic matter from soil because it's great for soil structure and holding water. Desertification and contamination. And I think it's also, on the science side, it's important for soil science community, but also the earth and environmental science community to really have better conversations and to find the role of soils and the knowledge that soil scientists have to bring them not just to agriculture, but to earth and environmental systems. There's a real place for that, but soil science is a young science, and it needs to find its way into the earth and environmental science systems. Okay, I have a closing story. Imagine there's a group of scientists, not us, other scientists, not like us. They're talking to God. They say, God, we no longer need you. We can clone people and we can do many miraculous things. And God listens and says, well, let's have a contest. Let's have a man-making contest like the way I made Adam, right? Formed out of the earth, out of the soil. So the scientists said, sure. One scientist bent down, grabbed a handful of soil, and God said, no, stop. Get your own soil. And I think that this is important. The soil, like so much in our life, is a gift from God. And soil is important for us, for humanity. It's one of those essential big three that I said. Natural resources, important for life. And it's important for us in our Catholic faith to be good stewards of the soil, to be able to work with the soil, understand the soil, and utilize the soil in a way that's honoring to God and honoring to people. And I think here in my presentation today, I wanted you to see that there are many different environmental kinds of topics, ecological topics, where the soil is important, and that we have our many opportunities to learn more, to care more. But I think a lot of this has to do with working together. It's not just going to be soil scientists in isolation, but part of the earth and environmental science community. Thank you so much for your attention.